So because of urban renewal, Newburyport's use of the waterfront is much different from the prevailing pattern of other seaport cities. Primarily the way they reused their waterfront was to gradually turn over the mercantile uses of the finger piers to a mix of private residential and retail and entertainment functions. So the pattern on most of the seaports along the East Coast is getting the private sector right out to the edge, activating that, and then encouraging the public to come along the edge. So for instance, this is the pattern you get in most seaport towns like Newport or any other waterfront community, Portland, Maine, where if the private sector can get to the water's edge, they do, and then they create a quasi-public realm out there for people to come out and enjoy it. There's another view of how you can think of this waterfront, and there is historical precedent for it. And I would say that a lot of the people in this audience may have this, whether you realize it or not, in your mind as the proper use of the waterfront. And that's the idea that the waterfront is this retreat or this separate place away from the city. And that has been done successfully, primarily through the influence of someone named Frederick Law Olmsted and this idea of the city beautiful. But we had, the best example that you would be familiar with is the Esplanade in Boston. But what's significantly different there is that there's a long, long stretch of it, and it has a certain dimension, a depth of it, so that once you enter that waterfront world, you really can leave behind the city. So it requires considerable depth, and really once you're there, it only offers one kind of activity, and that's the passive recreation of being in a green space. So I would say right off the bat that I think Newburyport is not all of that. It's not big enough to do that, and nor do I think it really should do that. But it offers an opportunity and a challenge that it could be a place for retreat from the hustle and bustle of the city, but it also can be a place for connection to the city, and that's what we've tried to work on. So we thought it would be interesting last time, and I want to reprise that this time, to look at the space and the way it's working right now, primarily with the objective of understanding how it might be made to work that way better by the addition of design. So it currently works in multiple interesting ways, both as a meander in terms of walking along the edge and as a gathering place, sort of assembling in the center. It's well loved by the residents and visitors, but there are opportunities to make it more so. And I offer this diagram to say that here are the three kinds of space, green space, that are out there right now. One of them, in the central sort of oblong shape in the middle, is the kind of gathering place, or the place that's in the center where people come together for some group activity. The other one is the edge condition, and that's the boardwalk, where you move along the edge and you're primarily focused out towards the water. And then surrounding that is a kind of ill-formed buffer space, which actually is doing a nice job of making both of those spaces, the centralized space and the edge space, the buffers, work better. But the edges of this main public space, the space that we would call the center of Market Landing Park, are really made primarily by pathways and a loose edge of landscape. And if you think about it, if you're out there in the space, there's nothing enclosing that other than the trees. And you can see through the trees to the parking. It's the original designer of that space was present at the last presentation I gave. I believe his name is Bob Eulig. Is that correct? Bob is a landscape architect, and his firm did the original design of Market Landing Park. And he stated at the end of my presentation that we had analyzed that correctly. They had always imagined that there would be more enclosure to make that park feel more like an outdoor room. And I think he interpreted that in terms of some modest amount of development to the west and east of the park. But I would say that even without that park is working very well, as all of you can attest. But if you look at it, you can see what I mean about it being bleeding out at the edges. It's a centralized gathering space, but the landscape buffer is diffuse and too thin to really enclose the space. So when you look at these photos all taken from the park, you can see that this is what the edge condition is that you're looking at. And the only reason you're not more aware of that parking and of the kind of ratty edge around it is because the space is so strongly organized around the stage area and the landing itself that your focus is always directed towards the water or towards whatever event is happening at that location, and you don't tend to look left and right or behind you. And the way it's working right now suggests for us as we move forward how it might be improved. Right now, the architecture in the case of the Firehouse, Firehouse Cafe is creating the sense of space in one way. It's one of the elements. You've got the water's edge, you've got the trees on the left and right, and you've got the Firehouse Cafe at the back end, which are helping to close off and complete that space. Now the edge space, the circulation along the boardwalk, and trust me, I'm going to go through this, I'm going to get to an actual proposal, but I think this is important. It's pleasant and it's enjoyed, as these photos evidence, in part because it's got that sense of enclosure. Remember, in architectural and urban design, edges are the things that make a place a place. And on the berm, somebody very skillfully created this raised berm using the granite stones that were, I believe, taken from the prior quay, and building those up and putting a landscape buffer between the parking and the boardwalk. It creates a kind of linear room with a focal point to the water, and those trees, this diagram is meant to show how the trees and the edge of the bench and the berm and the dock are all creating a backdrop for your focus to the waterfront, which is irresistible. But the enclosure is incomplete, and as you can see in this photo, you look right over that berm. That berm is about 10 to 15 feet deep at places, and the parking is right behind it. Now, that's not, you might say, well, so what? We love it the way it is, and I agree, it's great the way it is, but my contention is that it could be made better, even better. And you can see, just when I step back a little bit and look across the boat landing you can see the parking in the background. So from any vantage point, except for right at the water's edge, the parking is the primary backdrop to everything you're looking at. Now, another analysis of the site, that right now there are multiple opportunities, and I call them opportunities because they haven't all been actualized, for visual and pedestrian connections, but most are weak and incomplete, and how can they be improved? So if you look at this view, for instance, you see you do see the water, but you're looking over the parking to get there. On this view, you currently look through that gap in the buildings and there's a large landscaped berm there. So there's not really a great visual connection. I think it could be improved. It may not be improved by a view to the water unless we take down the landscape, but you could coordinate or organize that view. There are very little mixes of uses within the park except for the Firehouse Cafe. And is there an opportunity for more? I would say that everybody, by our report, and there may be people in this room who take a different opinion, but the consensus is that nobody seems to mind the cafe space at the back of the Firehouse Cafe that fronts on the park. It doesn't seem to be an intrusion or a diminishment of the quality of the park itself, and in fact it seems to add a venue that adds interest and amenity to the park. So we think that only instance of it happening on the park is successful and adds to the use of the park. And this connection to downtown. Currently there is no real connection to downtown in terms of a feathering of the uses or the cafe the Firehouse Cafe as it fronts onto the park is completely separate from Water Street or Merrimac Street, and we have none of these uses that suggest a blending of the urban or the pedestrian world into the green world. So I'll just make that point. And I want to add one other point, and that's just to say that whatever solution we come up with, another way to analyze this site is the layer upon layer upon layer of regulatory restriction and regimentation that's laid over this site. I'm not going to talk about all of this spaghetti of lines and numbers and setbacks, but they all represent a different restriction, some of them contradicting each other, some of them suggesting confusion about which governs, but anything that's done on this site is so looked at by so many different agencies that you'll really find as I go into the actual positive proposal here that the opportunity for mischief is small.